Pippa's on Twitter.
You can tweet her at PJC Hudson.
Right, just one last Scorpion question, I promise, or rather a comment on the email. Tony saying, can't you put your bed in glass jars for the Scorpions? Tony, you reminded me of that story the girls in boarding house with me who'd come down from Zambia used to do, that they told us that their beds at home were that you put the leg of the bed inside a glass, is it a mason jar, I think I'm thinking of. The idea was that scorpions are not able to climb up the glass of the jar. So even if they get into your bedroom, they can't physically make it into your bed itself. Doesn't solve the problem of getting up in the middle of the night and standing one, of course, but it does mean you don't have to check inside the bed covers. Thank you for that reminder, Tony. Okay. Right, and now for something completely different, as they say in the classics. Our life hack today is looking at how to apply for social grants if you don't have an official ID document or birth certificate. And sadly, there are more people than you think who fall into that category, particularly children. Did you know it's estimated there are as many as 500,000 children in this country who do not have a birth certificate? And in fact, that number is probably quite a lot higher than that because of the prolonged impact of COVID on Home Affairs services. I always feel a little funny using that phrase, Home Affairs services, because it's often in the absence rather than the presence. But yeah. 500,000 plus children who don't have that simplest of documents, their birth certificate saying, this is who I am, this is the date on which I was born, and here is my ID number. And the implications of that can be profoundly serious. UCT's Children's Institute is really worried about that figure, and they've stepped in to try and help by producing new materials that are trying to address this issue and help families grapple with how to apply for a social grant, even if you don't have a birth certificate. I'm intrigued to find out more. Mbonisi Nyathi is with us on the line, legal researcher, speaking on behalf of this project, the UCT Children's Institute, with the help of the Legal Resources Centre. Mbonisi, thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you and good afternoon to your listeners at home.
Why do so many children not have birth certificates? Is it because their parents simply don't have access to Home Affairs services, or is it because they don't know they're meant to apply?
So there are many reasons why some children do not have their certificate. So, but also it's dependent on Home Affairs services as well being available to them. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I can mention to you the type of children that are likely to not have birth certificate or are likely to struggle getting birth certificate. Yep. So those would be children born at home or in rural areas, orphaned children or abandoned children in the care of relatives. We can also have children in the care of unmarried fathers and mothers who has died or abandoned the family. Or you can have also children of mothers who do not yet have their own IDs. For example, teen mothers. If they have a birth certificate but they do not have an ID at the time they are giving birth, they cannot register that child. So their children are likely to not have a birth certificate until they are themselves documented. But then the challenge is that once it's after 30 days, it becomes a late birth registration. And the difficulties with late birth registrations, I think they've been documented quite,
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but the impact is what is important here. Mbonisi, if you don't have a birth certificate, what are the knock-on impacts on your life and your ability to navigate structures and systems in South Africa? What are the most crucial things that go wrong if you don't have a birth certificate?
So if you do not have a birth certificate, you are likely to be not able to access other services as well. Like, for example, getting a social grant or going to school or even opening a bank account or even finding an employment once you become an adult. Yeah. So there are a lot of challenges that comes with being without a birth certificate, because without that birth certificate, you are likely to not have an ID in the future, and there are other rights that are impacted by that, because most of the rights, you access them by the virtue of having your birth certificate or your ID.
Yeah, I mean, just think about how often you are required to produce your ID number, Mbonisi, to do anything from take out a store card to sign a form at the bank to get a travel document. I mean, it's an essential part of how the state recognize you as a South African individual. Now, let's talk specifically about the issue of social grants, because this is what the Children's Institute is particularly worried about. I believe that it's only roughly 10% of those should we call them undocumented in terms of birth certificates, those children are able to access social grants, which the state would otherwise be required to pay for their support. Mbonisi, tell us a little bit more about that aspect.
Yeah. So in terms of our estimates, so we say in 2017, at least 500 children in South Africa did not have a certificate. So, and at least 80% of those were South African citizens. So you can imagine with lockdown having significant reduced services at Home Affairs.
Yeah.
That number is likely to have increased. And also with budget cuts as well affecting the ability of Home Affairs to register. So in December 2022, we had only 50,000 children accessing social grants without the certificate. So we can see the disparity between our estimates of people who do not have the certificate and the people who are actually accessing it without the birth certificate.
Yeah. Okay, now, as you have pointed out there, it's then a large body of children who are affected and who are affected in their ability to apply for social grants. And a reminder to listeners, the Constitution says every child has the right to basic nutrition, shelter, basic healthcare services and social services. It doesn't say every child with an ID number and a birth certificate. So, Mbonisi, let's interrogate then. That means there must be a mechanism for somebody to apply for social support for a child, even if they don't have a birth certificate. How complicated a process is it?
So, in terms of Regulation 13.1 of the Social Assistance Act, it requires a parent or a caregiver when applying for a grant to submit an ID for themselves or a birth certificate for their child. But to ensure that the children are not deprived or even the caregivers themselves, if they do not have an ID or a birth certificate for their children, there is an exception to that law, which requires them to provide alternative documents. So it is possible for people who do not have birth certificate or IDs to even apply for the grant using alternative documents.
What sort of alternative documents? I mean, you're talking here about something which proves to SASSA that this child does exist and is out there needing support. Would something like a school report qualify, or your clinic card?
Alternative documents, there are many alternative documents that can be submitted in place of a birth certificate. That can be, as you mentioned, a school letter. It can be a road to health clinic card. It can be a baptismal certificate. It can be even, for example, for refugees. They can submit their Section 24 permit if they are refugees. That also suffices as alternative documents.
Okay. Now, the very fact that you have seen a need to produce a new document, sort of a booklet that talks people through this process, Mbonisi tells me that there's a lot of work needed to spread awareness of the fact that it is still possible to apply for a social grant even if your child doesn't have a birth certificate, and to talk people through this process. It's one thing to educate the public and the mothers out there and the fathers on how to apply. Mbonisi, what about the Home Affairs officials themselves and, not Home Affairs, the SASSA officials? Are they well briefed enough to know that it should be allowed and that it can happen and must be allowed if somebody comes to them and says, my child doesn't have a birth certificate, but here's their road to health card, here's their latest school certificate, these are my alternative documents? In general, is SASSA well equipped to deal with that kind of approach?
Unfortunately, in most cases, some local offices, local officials at local offices, they are not well equipped with such information. Hence the reason why we had to develop the material that we have developed, which is also based on SASSA's internal rules as well, and also based on our experiences that we've been seeing on the ground. That normally when people approach the local offices to apply for the grant, even without documents, they face challenges because, firstly, the officials who are supposed to assist them, they are not well aware of their own rules. So, which is a big challenge, because if you approach SASSA offices, and what they will tell you is that you have to produce your ID or you produce your birth certificate for the child. I can give you an example of some of the barriers that these caregivers are experiencing. The first issue that they will experience is with the security personnel in these local offices. They will ask you to positively identify yourself. By positively identify yourself, they mean that you have to produce your ID. So if you do not have an ID and you want to apply for a grant, even without that document, then it becomes very difficult. And also because in most cases, the security offices in SASSA officials, they are doing beyond what is they are employed to do, which is protect people in the queues. In most cases, they do the screening. We find them doing the screening, which they are not equipped to do, something that should be done by SASSA officials themselves. So those are the challenges that you face, that clients face when they are trying to access this social assistance.
Okay, so it can be an uphill battle is what I'm hearing. But Mbonisi, having a document like the one your team has put together obviously helps to clarify, set out very, very clearly what your rights are and how to go about setting out an application without a birth certificate. Now, the million-dollar question is accessing that material. I know you've already produced it in English. It would seem to me particularly important here in the Western Cape that we should need both an Afrikaans and an isiXhosa version as well. Is the intention to have it translated?
We have already translated it into isiXhosa. We're in the final stages of publishing the isiXhosa version, but so far currently we have the English one, but we are working with trying to finalize the isiXhosa version one so that it becomes available as soon as possible. But we'll be looking at the possibility of having other languages as well, because it's not only in the Western Cape, but it's also nationally that people are struggling to access this grant.
Okay, now the next thing is, where does one get hold of the existing material? So the English version is already available. If somebody wants to get their hands on it, Mbonisi, where can they find it?
They can find it in our website, at the Children's Institute website, which is ci.uct.ac.za, or they can also find it on our partners' website, the Legal Resource Center, which is Legal Resource Center, lrc.org.za. So they can find it on our website. And also on that information, it's also the information in terms of who they should contact if they are struggling to get assistance.
Mbonisi Nyathi, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, a legal researcher at the UCT Children's Institute. So again, a couple of options. You can access this document on CI for Children's Institute, ci.uct.ac.za. You can also go straight to the Legal Resources Centre, which is lrc.org.za. It's a very good brochure. It details clearly but simply what your rights are, what sort of alternative documents could be used in lieu of a birth certificate. There's a set of names and numbers and actual individual email addresses and cell phone numbers of who to call if the process is not working for you, which I think is incredibly helpful. So please do check it out if you know somebody who is needing assistance, struggling to get access to a social grant for a child because they don't have a birth certificate or ID.